So let's go ahead and begin with today's agenda first of all. So today we're going to be covering table objects in BarTender, specifically in BarTender 2019. So we'll cover what they are and what that means. Some of it is kind of self-explanatory in the title, but we're going to be discussing how they specifically relate to your BarTender designer. Once we understand what they are and a little background information on them, we'll cover creating the table objects. So how do you go about doing so? We'll have a tour of the user interface, so all the options, and I'll highlight some of the things that are going to be important for you to know as you're designing your tables and your templates. Then we're going to go through a couple demos. So the first one is going to be where we pass a table data from a data entry form, and we'll see what it's like from the print operator's perspective, and then we'll see how it's configured. And similar scenario for demo 2 as far as the perspective and then how it's configured. In that demo though, we're going to be using a database to source the data for our table. We're also going to be leveraging something called field functions or table field functions, and we'll learn a little bit more about that as we get through it. If any of the terms or anything like that doesn't make sense, I'm sure that we'll explain it at some point or another. And if not, please do ask in the question section. So we begin with the table objects in BarTender section. So as most of you can imagine, in BarTender, a table functions looks like anyways visually, just like you would picture it in your head. But specifically to BarTender, what it allows you to do is you create a table and then you have a couple different options. So you can create a standard table where you set the rows and columns and you just insert barcodes, insert images, or insert text objects within it. You can set properties such as resizing things or grouping certain cells, etc., and making sure that everything or your template is formatted as you like it to. You can also source the data for your table from a database as well. So that would be a connection that's independent from that of the template. Lastly, one of the nice features about using the table and the database in combination is that you're able to use the field functions, as I mentioned. So whenever you have a scenario where at the end of the page or at the end of the print job itself, you get a scenario where you need the sum or the average, so let's say like the total price or the total number of copies or quantities, etc. We can calculate that function for you. And we'll see how that's all configured within BarTender itself, and you'll also see that in the demo. So creating a table object in BarTender. So it's going to be pretty straightforward. What you'll want to do is you'll want to click on the table icon up on your toolbar, and then you're going to select, and it's important to know that if you want to select just the insert table option, that's just going to be your standard, static table, or you want to create a table from a database. And the second scenario is going to be what I mentioned earlier, where the data itself is sourced from a database, and that connection is independent of that on the table. So this is how you go about that, and what's going to happen is just like any other object in BarTender, you're going to click on it, it's going to change your cursor, you're going to be able to then place the table that you just created or selected wherever you need it on your template. Alternatively, or if you have your UI set up a little bit differently, up at the top, you click on Create and then Table. So once we've created the table itself, we're going to have some options or some configuration that we need to do. Just like anything else in BarTender, such as like a barcode that has its properties or a text object that has its own properties, the tables have their own properties as well. So when we go through and we either right-click the table and hit Properties, or we double-click on it, we'll see the dialog presented here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one of these options, and some of them are going to be quicker, more brief than others, and just kind of review what options we have available to us. Some things are shared across other object types in the BarTender designer, but we'll review them as well, just since they're here. We'll start at the top, and we have the table itself section in the properties. So this is going to be where you set your dimensions. So if you would like us to automatically calculate your width and height, we can enable that here. Or if you have a scenario where you have a specific area or box where your table needs to exist, this is where you would enable that. Now, if you do source your table from, like, let's say, for example, from a database somewhere, and the data exceeds what can be fit in the size that you set here, what's going to happen is it's going to fall over into the next printed label. So if we only allow, let's say, 3 rows and we select 9 from our database, we're going to have, the product is going to be 3 labels. So kind of like the same basis or premise, if you will, from just your standard database connection in BarTender. This is also going to be where, if you want to show your grid lines, this is where you can opt to enable or disable that. Next, we move into the rows and columns. So we'll begin with rows, and this is going to be pretty important in your configuration of your table and how you want it to behave. Now, depending on how you have your data organized, and that's going to be down in the table data, we'll get there. Depending on how you have your data organized, you may or you may not see certain things here. So the way I have it configured here in this screenshot is I have all my rows and everything is pretty much set to data. If you look at template data, and we have another slide coming up on that, that's going to be an important thing to note for each one of your rows or columns, because that's going to change and you're going to need to change it based on your requirements. Otherwise, we can set other properties here. So how do we want each one of those rows to behave as far as the dimensions itself, and if you want it to show if empty. Each one of the rows, depending on which one you select, is going to have its corresponding row properties there off to the right. So I mentioned the table data there. If we click on rows on the left and select the row in the middle where it says rows that we want to manipulate, and then on the right where it says table data where the cursor is, so assuming we're organized by rows, this is going to be where you set how you want this row to behave. Now, if we have it set to data, it's going to be either just whatever data you type in, whatever static data, or it's going to be whatever database data. So if it's a table sourced from a database, that's where your record set would go essentially. Then we have your table header, table footer, and same thing for the page header, page footer. So do we want a header and footer at the beginning and end of each page, or do we want it at the beginning and end of each job? So that's going to be where you set that behavior. So an example would be, do you want the total for that label to be calculated at the end, or do you want the total for the whole job to be calculated at the end? And then the last one is going to be group headers and group footers. So you can select under what criteria things group, and you can group them if you'd like. Going into columns, we see that option is missing from the column properties on the right. And as I mentioned, I'm organized by rows, so I no longer have accessibility to that option. It's just not even in the UI. And that's the reason that that's happening. So here, same thing, instead of selecting my row, I'm going to select my columns and how I want them to behave. We then move into borders and shading. So this is going to be a little bit more kind of like the table option. It's going to be a little bit more of kind of just general configuration. Do we want borders? How thick do we want them? The color? If we want a dotted line or anything like that. This is where we would set all those properties in regards to that. In the example that we have coming up later, it's shown where for the footer, what I do is I disable everything but the top side for the border. So it kind of looks like the bottom calculation that we do, the function, is free floating there under the table. Then we get into table data. So if you have a static table, so not associated with a database, you're not going to spend much time in here. But if you are going to be sourcing data from a database or one of the other options for the sources, which we'll see in a moment, you are going to be spending time in here. And this is going to be where, as I mentioned previously, where you arrange your data. So at the top towards the right where you see table data and arranged in rows, if I were to change that to arranged by columns, it would switch that option up that we just reviewed, and it would change it from the row section to the column section. So then you can make a column the header and footer or data section of your table. In this particular screenshot here, I'm sourcing from a database. I'm organized by rows, and I went through the database setup, which would be your standard BarTender database setup wizard that we're familiar with. You're going to go through there, select your database, select your table, and we see a sample record set here. That's actually some dummy data there and unrelated to today's demo. We're still in the same table data section here. So clicking on the table data dropdown, our options are on the left. Our options are either none, arranged by rows, or arranged by columns, as I mentioned. If you're not connected to a database or any other source, this will default to none, and that's where you want to leave it. If you do want to change what source you're connected to on the right, those are the options that you have available to you. So database, file names and folder, VB script, or printers. There's going to be a use case for each one. The most common one, though, I envision is probably going to be the database option. And then we can move on to the second to the last option there, which would be your positioning. So this is going to be pretty familiar to other objects or other property objects that you see throughout your designer. So this is where you set your anchor, a reference point, your X and Y, and from where your measurement is oriented from. If you want to rotate. And I don't have any additional layers. I just have a single layer here in my designer for this template. So if you did have multiple layers or you wanted to lock the object, that's where you would manipulate those settings. Moving on to the last one, it's going to be error handling. So this is going to be another one that's going to be pretty much in every object property. Now, the error conditions, though, do vary based on the type of object that you have selected. So on this one, we only have one criteria to manipulate. You will see more for other object types. So pretty much what ends up happening, or the way that it works, is there's a error condition. So when that occurs, how would you like us to respond? So error condition, action to take. And you can go from, something passive to just ignore all errors, or, don't ask me, don't bother me, just print the job however it is, to something more customizable where, we hash out the label, or we print a large red X, or even a black box or something like that. And we can even opt to present the print operator with the option to abort the job. So that's going to be the error handling. And then we're going to move into a different section, still in the properties. So for all of these, remember, we're in the table properties themselves. So we right-click the table, we go to the properties. Now, let's say that we're using the table field functions, which is available when you connect your table to a database. Then you have the option within a data source to change your data source type to this table data field, and we'll get down to that option. So now we're in your standard text properties, but we're only going to go through kind of the relevant to today's topic options. So we have the few at the top that's, font, text format, autofit, so your usual basic properties for your text object. Then we have cell alignment, and that's where we start. So in our text property, cell alignment, this is where we can say how we want that particular cell to behave and how we want it aligned. And if you need any padding, rotation, etc., this is where that would be configured. The next one is going to be, because we already covered borders and shading and error handling, we'll go ahead and skip those. The next one is going to be the data source itself. So if you look on the right, on the data source tab, under type, you have table data field. So now, a little warning on that. If you don't have your table connected to a database, you're not going to get this data source available to you. So you want to make sure that you go through that process first and make sure that that's configured. Otherwise, you won't see this option to change the type to the table data field, and you won't get any of the properties below it, of course. So we do have this table connected to a database, though. We can change the type from embedded data or database field or whatever it may be previously to a table data field. The next thing we're going to want to do is specifically what table are we talking about. So let's say we have a few different tables on our template. We want to reference the specific one. Then getting more finite from there, we want to reference what field name. So this is going to change where it says expiration date, offset, and days. That's actually particular to my sample data in my database. Your fields are very likely to be different. So that's going to be different, but you want to select the appropriate one for your scenario. Then we get to the checkbox and enabling or disabling that checkbox that says calculate sum or other function. So when you get to that checkbox, that's going to be what exposes the other functionality that we talked about. So if we select under functions, and let's go ahead and just go to the next slide here. So on the left, if we select functions, we change from count and we can change to any of the supported ones. So today, I think in the example, we do sum and we do count. So, but any of the other ones that call for, if your scenario calls for anything else, you would select the appropriate one. And the last option to take into account is going to be the all records, which is on your right. So all records are current page. So you can run a function on a specific page and each page be independent, or do your whole record set, which is what's going to happen when you go to print. I guess I should mention it is the sample data. So when we're not connected to the database, when we're just in the designer working on our template, what kind of sample data do we have? Generally speaking, and not just related to tables specifically, what I always suggest for the sample data is use something that's semi-real world. So if you have a serial number that's going to be 20 digits long, you probably want to throw, even if it's X's or zeros or whatever it may be, something that's comparable in length for formatting reasons. So we don't want barcodes running off on us. We don't want to encounter a long string in 2 months and then our label just becomes invalid or no longer adheres to whatever regulation we may have. So it's a good idea just in general in the BarTender world to provide sample data that's similar in length and formatting to what is the actual use case when we actually start printing. So that's a little bit of the background, and once you kind of know where everything is, it is pretty straightforward. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to move into the first demo. So in this demo, we have a BarTender document, a label that we need to print. Our BarTender document, we'll just pretend that we're a medical supply company of some sort or a distributor of some sort for medical products such as, simple over-the-counter things. And what we're going to do is, in this demo, we're going to be passing data to our table from a data entry form. And for the first part, what we'll do is we'll see what it looks like from a print operator's or a user standpoint once it's all already buttoned up and done. Now keep in mind that I am printing directly from the designer here. You would probably want to configure this to be printed either via print station. Maybe you want to create a process around this where it's just a simple click off the desktop. And just to add a little bit of comfort level to the print operator or the user, the end user, and then also a little layer of security, if you will, if you don't have security enabled. So your formatting doesn't get messed with accidentally or intentionally, because it happens, right? So we'll go ahead and we'll play this demo. And we're just going to hit print. That's what our layout looks like. For this demo, I selected PDF so we can get a visual on it. And pretty much all we're going to do is we're going to click on the drop downs for all the different rows that we have on our table. And the way that it works is each one of the rows on the table is associated with one of the rows here at the data entry form. We have the form set to recycle for us or automatically come up once again once it printed a job. So since I've gone through this twice here in the demo, what's going to happen is, or the product of this, should be 2 PDFs. At this point, we can bring up a folder in Windows where we have our default location to where we print. We're going to open the first one, and that's a little visual of what it looks like. And this would be kind of like a little sample box packing slip, something you get like from Amazon or any seller that you get online now, just with the contents of what's in the box. And that's going to be our product. So we see that we have various lengths with various types of data, and everything gets auto-sized and formatted and fits. And just from a, whether you want to call it, being organized or an aesthetics point of view, it looks just cleaner to have it in this fashion here and leverage the functionality of the table. So that's what the print operator will see. Let's go ahead and review how that was configured. So we'll go into the template itself once again. And what we'll do for this clip is we'll go into the properties. And remember, this is going to be where we just reviewed everything. So in this example, I don't have any formatting or anything like that in my rows or columns. I don't have any organization, but I do have objects within each cell, and each one of those objects has a data source, and each one of those data sources are named. I also have autofit enabled, so I want it to fit within a given area. I want it to fit in my cell here. So I went ahead and enabled that as well. And I go through there and we see item 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the quantity has the same thing. Going to our form, each one of these drop-down lists here is linked to its corresponding named data source. Item 1 is item 1. But also each one of these drop-down lists is then connected to a database. And that database is passing the value for my drop-down list. So that's where all those values come from. And the reason you might want to do that is user error, right? We don't want people typing these things in because even the best of us, we make mistakes and typos and all that. So we want to eliminate that, and we want to link all the data sources and make it as easy and as quick as possible to do so. Then here we see that the quantities are linked to their corresponding data source as well. And then from there, that's how that particular example was configured. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Now, the next one is actually a little bit more complex. So we're using the same layout, the same record set, same kind of scenario, but instead of printing and prompting the user to enter or select all the lines, we have a table, we've linked it to the database, and we're going to pull in all the data, all the record set for whatever you want to call it, that order, that shipment. And it can be anything that applies to your situation. And we're also going to be leveraging our field functions to calculate the total number of quantities or items there, or lines I should say, and also the total price. So we'll go ahead and we'll see once again what it looks like from a print operator's perspective. So we're in the designer once again. We're going to hit print and PDF print. Just like that, it's going to be pretty quick and simple, which is a good thing from this perspective, right? We're going to get our PDF directory up. We're going to open the PDF, and we see that we've pulled in the record set, and we don't have enough room in the first one, in the first page. So what we did is we overflowed into the second one. In the second one, we do have enough space. And also note, we calculated the total price and item count. And there was no VB script or anything like that going on in the background that calculated that. It was just one of those functions that we've been talking about a lot, and we just selected the correct one and merged some cells. On that note, let's go ahead and see how that was configured. So we'll go back to our designer. We're going to begin by going to the properties of our table, and we're going to begin in the rows and columns section there. And you see here, it's important to note that I have 3 rows, but you see the table data, I have one set to page footer. I have another one set to data. So data is, in this scenario, data is my record set. That's how I got that whole record set to come in. I select data on there. And then I have my page header. So those are going to be critically important when you're designing this type of table. Under my table data, I've arranged it by rows, not by columns. That's, self-preference or optional, if you will. And then I have my own independent database connection here. And this is my record set that we see has printed. So based on that previous configuration that we did, we allowed the print operator, or we gave them that functionality without them having to do anything. And here we see how we can format some of our cells as well. So if I wanted that particular field, which is in this case my data row, I can format them as such. Going into my footer row here, we see that under the data sources, I have a mix of embedded data. So where it says quote unquote semi-count, semicolon, and then this table data field, I can have a mix of whatever I need to format things correctly. Usually, right, item count or things like that, prefixes and suffixes, they don't come in bunched with our data from wherever we're sourcing from regardless. But we do have here, once we get to the table data field, I selected my table, I selected my field name, and then I selected my function, which is to count. If I go into the properties of my other one, it would be sum. So I want it to run on all records. I have my sample data just set to 0, 0. I didn't anticipate it being much longer than that. And that kind of concludes our second demo. We do have my colleague Jasper Wen organizing the questions for us. So Jasper, whenever you're ready.
I think a good question to start with is what addition is required for the use of this table object?
It does depend on specifically what you want to do. Remember that we have built-in warnings, and you'll see them if you exceed your addition. But if you just want to create a table and just throw static text objects on there, let's say you just need it to format and keep things organized, that kind of thing, you can do that with the free edition. Now, if you want to get a little bit more fancier than that, as far as anything database connected or any of the organization or anything like that which is associated with the database, you're going to need a pro or higher.
Are there any limitations on the objects you can insert into the table?
No, there's not. So you're going to want to be aware of, the size of things and formatting and all that, because, you have a finite set of real estate on your template. But no, so pretty much any object that you have on your template, and even if it exists outside of the table right now, you can just click, drag, and drop it into the cell that you would like, where you would like that to exist.
Can you apply transforms or conditionally show or print objects inside a table, or can you actually do that on the entire table itself?
Yeah, so the table object itself has its properties as we saw. So just like any other object that has a properties option in BarTender, you can set a condition under which that will print. So you'll use the same, if you're familiar with that, of course, I'm making an assumption. So you would use the same dialog, the conditional statement dialog that you would use for any other object, and you can rename the table as such. Going a level down from that, any object or even data source, if you want to go down even further, also has its own properties as well. So if you want to set conditions on any of those objects, they're objects, so they're handled in the same fashion. So yes, it's possible.
You mentioned that the database connection on the document and the table object itself are independent of each other. Can you explain how that kind of works and what happens when you print?
So when you make a database connection with the table, we're going to pull in that whole record set, and it's going to be unrelated to whatever else or whatever other connections you may have going on, or any other actions, unless you're specifically manipulating the table. So what that means is each thing is going to do its own thing. So if you have a table associated with the database, depending on how many records you have to print, it'll act accordingly. If you connect a template to a database, and depending on how many records you select, it'll act accordingly. So the only thing is you may end up with a scenario where you have maybe 10 records to print at the template, but you only have 2 labels to print worth of table data. So you might get some uneven printouts there. But as long as you take it into account and your data is organized in the fashion that it behaves as you would like it to, maybe some conditional statements, it's fine to use as many connections or all the connections if that's what you need.
Is there a way to actually filter the data if you're connecting to a database for the table object?
Yeah, so the options are a little different for the data coming in for tables. In the database connection, you still have the filter option. And what you can do is you can set static filters, item equals item X, or you can even link it to global data fields or named data sources. So whenever item number equals named data source, you can have a scenario like that. Now, if you don't have any global data fields, or if you don't have any named data sources on your template, you won't see those options in the filter. So you'll have to create it for that option to appear.
Is there a way you actually can modify the data in the particular table object at print time?
Sounds like the question is pretty much if you're pulling in data from a database and you want to be able to manipulate it via maybe a data entry form. What I would probably do is I would connect my template to a database, associate that field to a named data source, put that named data source in my table, and then at print time, I can manipulate it. I would want to hear more of the scenario to give, like the best suggestion, but it should be possible. It just depends on the circumstances.
So if your data is too large, does it automatically go on to the second page or second printed item?
I guess there's 2 parts to that question. So if we're talking about a specific record, let's talk about the specific cell. You can set properties for that cell. You can set it to wrap, you can set it to get so big, and you can set a threshold, and you can set all those kind of like auto size or auto format properties. If you exceed the thresholds that you set, that's when you would get like a truncation or data cutting off. And then you need to exceed that threshold or figure out a better layout. If we're talking about records and you have only space for 3 records, but you're really trying to print 30, then yes, we'll automatically do the math for you and say, okay, he's printing 30, he or she's printing 30. We need 10 labels to print. And that's not something that you'll have to select or figure out on your own. You just give us the data and we'll automatically calculate that. The only thing to be aware of, and it's usually not an issue or deal breaker for most scenarios or most environments, is if you have a partial. So if you have 3 records allowed and you pass 4, let's say, you're going to have a label with 3 and then 1 with 1 record. So you'll have those spaces empty. And there is options, kind of like we saw in the tour of the UI section. You do have options as far as how you would like things handled when they're blank.
What's kind of the use case or scenario for using the table object?
Yeah, so it's going to be any time that you want to, organize your data in a fashion, where you auto-size, and it kind of like, like I said, just from an organization, this is part one, but just from an organization standpoint, formatting standpoint, it just allows you to clean things up. So it's just a divider, if you will, just like any other table. Going into part two, and which is a little bit more powerful, is when you connect to a database, you can pull in multiple records per label. And you don't have to anticipate the logic of, oh, I have, 10 items to ship. Do I really need 10 labels? Like that kind of scenario, or how many can I fit within a given template? Instead, you kind of set your settings, you set your threshold, and you just give us data and we go off and print. And we worry about organizing it, formatting it, and deciding how many labels you actually need. Part B of part two, if you will, is going to be all the table functions. So it's very common to need some sort of function executed on your bulk of data for that job or for that page, whether it be quantity, whether it be pricing, whether it be averages, whether it be the minimum or the maximum, whatever function that you need. There's a lot of scenarios out there that call for that. Just like a packing slip or invoice label of such, they always have something to that degree or something to that effect located on there. So if you come across any of those situations, that's where it applies. And there's a lot of other little niche scenarios as well, just like any other feature or option out there, where when you come across it, and as long as you have this in your back pocket, you understand that this is an option, you're able to adapt it to that specific scenario. On behalf of myself, Jasper, and everyone here at Siegel, thank you.